Hi, yeah, my name is David. I work at the Lean FRO, and I'm going to be doing the public reveal of what I've been up to for the last couple of months, which is a DSL-based approach for writing documentation for, about, and in Lean. So, before I get into how the thing works, I figure I should show you what it actually does. So, if you've been to the Lean website in the last week or so, and you're a particularly observant person, you may have noticed that the little banner that used to be down here that said "Made with Jekyll" had disappeared. And that is because the Lean website has not been made with Jekyll for about a week. And if you have reloaded the webpage within the last hour, and you're a particularly observant person, you may have also noticed that a little tab up here called Blog has appeared. So what's on this tab? Well, we can see there's a couple of blog posts. And if I click on the first one of them, we can see that my colleague Joachim has written this great blog post about recursive definitions. There's more on the way. I'd encourage you not to read all of the text, which is why I've not zoomed in very much. You can go to the website and read them later in the coffee break or at your leisure. But you can see that there's some embedded Lean code because, when we're writing about Lean, we want to embed Lean code. And if I put the mouse over things, it tells me about those things. If I put the mouse over the word start, then all the occurrences of start light up. If the same thing happens here, it respects scoping. I've got a call to eval. We can see the output in a little pop-up, and we can also see the output down here in the text. Scrolling through the document, there's a lot of these kinds of features that you'd expect from a tool like this for describing Lean code. Rather than sort of give you a deeper tour of the contents of the blog post, I'd like to show you its source code. Here's the definition of search that we saw, and we see this looks an awful lot like Markdown, right? So we can click on search, and we see all of our features work in our embedded code examples here. We've got our output here, right? So we said we got a code block that says search, and then we're going to call this stuff, and this particular code block is named eval1. And then down here, we say that we're showing the output from eval1, which happened to be 11. But let's say we'd made a typo and we'd written 111. Oh, that's an error. We see that it expected 11, but it got 111. The text of the error message isn't great yet, but it's still the early days of the tool. And I can come in and I can just say, fix it for me. Scrolling through the document, we can see there's a lot more of sort of ordinary textual looking things. But we've got reasonable IDE support in the ways that we expect in writing Lean. So if I mouse over here, I get a little pop-up saying it's a header. Maybe I haven't written much Markdown before. Here I can see that it's emphasis. If I can convince it to pop it up, it's not doing it for me right now. Such is life. I've got a bulleted list here. I could come here and I could say, I'd rather have a numbered list and have it converted to a numbered list, numbered 1, 2, 3, and if I come down and I make some more changes here, we could see, we've got an error message that's showing up, and this error message text. Well, this error message text happens to include a line number, so let's say we changed our line number a little bit. This doesn't match anymore. Luckily, I can fix it and update the text, and as you can see, it takes a little bit of time to re-elaborate everything. That'll get fixed as time goes, but it fixed up the line number for me so that the text now matches. So the idea here is that you can have a nice testable workflow for describing Lean in many, many different contexts that's extensible by users to do whatever they want. So back to the overall context. So in this year, I'm going to be spending a lot of time on documentation for Lean. And the model I'd like to follow is one that's been pioneered in the Python community that I think is quite good, where you really have sort of 4 categories of documentation. There's sort of reference material. I think the only tool we really have dedicated for that is DocGen. The idea with reference is this is where you look up the specific details of whatever it is that you're using to get your work done at the current moment. Then there's explanatory material, which is explaining the ideas behind things, sort of setting them in a context, being pedagogical, and these shouldn't really be the same document in this model. There's also how-to guides, which are a step-by-step list of how to approach something, and tutorials. And tutorials are meant in a very specific sense in this context. It's really intended to be something for somebody who's never used the language before, who's just getting started, totally bulletproof, thoroughly tested. And like the testing support in empty book isn't super suitable for that. Um, and in some sense, you've got sort of two dimensions. You've got whether something is aimed at acquiring knowledge or just sort of getting something done step by step, and also whether you use it when you're learning about the system or when you're actually working really hard to get your particular task completed. If you'd like to see more about this model, then you can watch this talk, What Nobody Tells You About Documentation from PyCon Australia in 2017, or go to documentation.divio.com, where the author of that model works. But it has been adopted a lot of places, and it's nice. But much is written about Lean that actually isn't software documentation, right? I mean, we have blueprints. We've seen a lot of those at this conference already. People are writing research papers about Lean. Hopefully, also, we're going to be having many research papers that include Lean, but are sort of written in an informal style. We want to have good integration between those to prevent LaTeX transcription mistakes. I mean, what good is the formal proof preventing your mistakes if you make the mistakes when you type in the math in a human readable form? We want to write textbooks. As you saw, we're writing blog posts and lots more, right? The sky's the limit. We want to write lots of things about Lean. And I think the key insight here is that there isn't really ever going to be one tool that's going to serve all of these use cases very, very well. We could make a bunch of tools, or that each serve them that sort of each serve one of these use cases quite well, but that's a ton of work. Or we could kind of sort of use things in ways that they're not great for. Or we can build a tool for making tools such that when you want to do something that isn't what other people are doing, you can reuse the parts of their work that make sense, but not be required to reuse the parts that don't make sense. And then just do the work to fill in the gaps yourself. So the system that I've been building for this, which is called Verso, as you saw, it gives a concrete syntax in a Lean file, which is sort of very much like Markdown. And just to prove that it's a Lean file, I'll pop back over and scroll up to the top of the file, where we can see that actually it is just a Lean file. And then we switch over into documentation mode. And then that is parsed into ordinary Lean syntax. And by syntax here, I mean the data type called syntax, which is the output of Lean's standard parser. Then, of course, we have a macro expansion step where we can fill out extensions to the language with, translate them back into the language. But eventually, we arrive at an AST data type. And this is where we leave the compile time of the document. Right, so we produced essentially Lean code, which is describing a data type, which is the document. Then the runtime of the documentation tool is going to be, first off, a traversal over the entire document, which is building up some state, which we do repeatedly. The reason for this is to deal with things that don't follow the module structure of Lean. So for example, cross-references. If you have index entries, if you have vocabulary entries, if you have references to other chapters or other sections of your document, it's important that these are in some sense global. You should be able to do a forward reference just as easily as you can do a back reference. And that doesn't play well with programming language that doesn't allow cyclic modules. So just as LaTeX will from time to time say, please run me again, please run me again, please run me again. Okay, now I'm actually done. This system will be very user-friendly, and it'll run itself as many times as needed. And after that, whatever genre you're working in, let's say you're writing a blog post, it'll spit out some HTML. If you're writing a textbook, it may spit out HTML in one big file, HTML in lots of little files, EPUB so you can read it on your Kindle, and LaTeX so you can send it to your publisher. And the idea is that the set of outputs is not fixed in advance by me. I want to provide libraries for generating commonly needed output formats, but you should be able to make whatever output you need for whatever purpose you're doing. If you want to make 90s Windows help files, go for it. So I've been talking about genres. And when I talk about genres, well, what are the genres here? Well, genres affect your use of Verso at 3 times. When you're writing your document, when you're building your document, and then when you're generating whatever the output is that the user is going to want to read. So at the time of writing, the genres have a huge effect. So first off, the AST of Verso documents is extensible. So a genre can provide additional block or inline elements. So the blog genre right now provides those code blocks, although those are going to be generalized to work for others. It also provides a blob of HTML element because maybe you just need to include some HTML in your website. And it also includes a cross-reference thing where you can refer to another page on the site by its identifier, like the module it's defined in, rather than where it is in the URL hierarchy of the site. And this is because then you'll never have a broken link. They can also provide section or document metadata, like the author of a blog post. They can provide a set of macros and extensions to the documentation language. They can provide linters. I don't have any of those implemented yet, but it's on the roadmap. The idea is that you could, for example, have a linter that gives a yellow squiggles if you don't capitalize your section headers consistently. And then also code actions, like you saw, the one that renumbers lists. A genre might provide its own genre-specific code actions as well. When building a document, first off, the genre provides the overall outer structure. We're not trying to shoehorn web routing and URL to document mapping into the text of documents here. Instead, there's just a data type that describes a website, and that includes some documents in the appropriate spots. And for some genres, there may not be any interesting outer structure. For others, there may be. The idea is that we should be flexible and allow you to do what you need. They also define a notion of this global metadata table for cross-references and things like that. And also they can provide metadata-aware transformations that occur during this stateful traversal of the document. So for example, you may want to refer to, the name of another section and have it automatically update itself as you edit the section title, or you might want to have the author of a site of somebody from your bibtec file, because first you got to write a bibtec processor, but I'm sure someone will do that at some point. And you may want to include the author name, like the equivalent of like / site author from tech. And finally, at the time of output, Verso the framework doesn't really give any requirements. It says that every genre should provide its own main function that that users can call, and then document that appropriately and tell them what to do. So this is to provide the ability to really generate any format you need to generate and do any other work you need to do. And then, of course, they're going to create the actual output on disk or wherever else you want it. And so I keep saying markdown-like, markdown-ish, dialective markdown, and a lot of people are going to say, like, well, why not just use markdown, right? I mean, most lean documentation today is written using markdown. And I do think being broadly compatible with markdown is very important because people are familiar with it. But there are specific reasons not to just say we're going to adopt common mark and write a compliant common mark parser, for example. And so one of those reasons can be seen here. So this is an example of some markdown text, right? So we've got a little bit of sort of fictitious documentation, which includes a code block. And then we can see a sort of fake rendered example that I put in my slide here. And note that the closing code, the closing backtick there, that's not at the end of the line. What if I don't notice it and then I delete it? What happens to my output? According to the definition of markdown, my output now has a backtick in the middle of it and no code at all. And this kind of thing is probably actually a mistake in practice. So if I'm going to try to figure out, what's going on here, like I'm going to have to proofread my document to see what happened. Like, why is it weird? Maybe I'll get a bug report from like a student reading the website, reading the textbook online, saying like, there's some bogus formatting here. Like it's much better if instead, when I delete my closing line, I just get some red underline in my editor and it says syntax error. I expected a closing backtick. Like this trade-off of markdown, I think is more appropriate for other use cases than for technical writing. I think this is a much better design for writing large technical documents. Another issue that makes Markdown less suitable for this particular task is that header nesting is a bit of a free-for-all in Markdown. Like there's a convention that the top level header is used for a document title, and inside of that you can kind of just put whatever header you want wherever. And what does that mean? So what we're going to do, what Verso does, is it just requires that headers start at number 1 and that they're well nested. And right. So if you want to fix this syntax error, then you just get rid of that extra hash mark, and then it'd be okay. And well nesting is nice on the one hand because it removes the ability to make mistakes that would be confusing, but even more so, it gives nicer semantics for document inclusion. Right. So if we take this bit of text that we've written, we stick it in a little file called elab section, and we write another document. And in that document, we then include the contents of elab section. Okay, so inclusion, if that were textual inclusion, then we'd be taking the contents of that file and sticking them up here. But now we've got a problem, right? These headers don't really fit in the spot where they were placed. But by saying that headers are all essentially relative rather than essentially absolute, the tool becomes free to replace them with the thing that makes sense in the context where they are used. So that gives a better semantics for document inclusion, which can be very important if you're trying to work on something in in little bits and pieces and with co-authors and that kind of thing. So there's some other reasons not to use Markdown as well. The first is that it allows arbitrary HTML to be embedded, which is great if you're making a web page, but not so great if you're making essentially anything else that isn't a web page. And so the idea in Verso is that if you want, if your genre should allow the inclusion of arbitrary HTML or arbitrary tech or arbitrary EPUB flavored HTML or whatever other format you need, then you should provide an appropriate extension to the AST to support that and an appropriate macro that will expand to it. Similarly, Markdown has some quite complicated precedence rules, which govern what happens if you don't nest your asterisks and underscores in a way that would seem to make sense, right? If you say, asterisk, hello, underscore, I am, asterisk, David, underscore, some of that will be bold and some of that will be italic, or sorry, double asterisks. But it's a little bit hard to predict which one will be which if you haven't memorized all these precedence rules. So in Verso, we just say you have to nest things appropriately and escape them otherwise. Otherwise, it's a syntax error. One of the biggest worries with Markdown is that there's no standard extension mechanism. So there are a number of extension mechanisms for Markdown. So I could have, of course, made another one. And that's probably what I'd have done if there weren't all these other reasons. But having no standard extension mechanism means that many extension mechanisms exist and they don't compose very well because they tend to be based on regular expression munging of the source text. And this is difficult if you want to have a big library for documentation authors who can make tools that work well together. It's much better to have a standard syntax for extensions and then allow people to use something like like a function name to pick what their particular extension is and the module system. And then also Markdown has a lot of quite obscure in that they're not used very much, but also expensive to implement features if you want to be compliant. So for example, it distinguishes between tight and loose lists. I'm not entirely sure where I would want to use that distinction, but you do need to implement it if you want to have a correct implementation. It has indented code blocks. So if most like original Markdown didn't have the backtick code blocks that we have today. Instead, you had to indent things by 4 spaces. And 4 spaces of indentation having a special meaning is something that just makes parsing the rest of Markdown very, very much more complicated and difficult and surprising. And then also it has things like setx headings, so most people write Markdown with headings using hash marks like I've been showing in this document, but there's an alternative syntax which is also part of the standard where you use different kinds of underlines the next line below the heading to keep track of header levels. And I wanted to avoid having that complication as well. So I hope that what you're thinking is, wow, I want this. When can I use it? So, and if you're not thinking that, then I hope I could do something that'll help you think that eventually in the future. But sort of a rough timeline for when you can expect these things to be in your hands. Uh, so if we sort of take a look at the year, we're in January right now. And in January, as of today, as of about an hour ago, there's a preview up. You can go download the source code, you can play with it. I won't be providing any tech support for a little while because I want to focus on making a bit more progress on the development first. So what I'll be doing is getting in touch with various people who have written a lot of documents in Lean and about Lean, and sort of serially one after the other, so that I don't waste their time on fixing feedback that somebody else has already provided, or making somebody provide feedback that somebody else has already provided. And then I'll make the system better for those users first, and then after that start sort of branching out and providing more public support. But feel free to download it. If you find bugs, please report them. Happy to get that. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on tech support quite yet because I want to maintain a high velocity of feature development. In March, I hope to have a first release that I expect to be actually usable for people in the community who don't have sort of easy access to me on a regular basis to fix all the problems that they find and add all the missing features. I expect that by March, the system should be usable for writing software manuals. It should have integration with doc strings, so you can say like, give me all the docs for everything in this namespace and put them here in my document, or we should be able to link to document topics from doc strings, those kinds of things. But there'll probably likely be some rough edges, and the metaprogramming framework will likely not be sort of super well thought out at that point. It'll likely just be exposed guts of the system to start with. And I hope that by June, we'll have a full, polished, nice release together with, sort of default templates with good graphic design in them, something that looks at least as good as MDBook. Integration with Reservoir. I don't know what the precise character of that integration is going to be yet. That is something that'll emerge from conversations with Mac, from my colleagues, and from users who want to use the system. And also, as Lean gets support for a racket-style #lang, I'd like to integrate that as well, both for having the user experience be nicer from a syntactic perspective, but also #lang is going to enable us to have features like parser error recovery and incremental elaboration, sort of one paragraph at a time, like Lean files are taken one command at a time, which we just can't do with the current structure of Lean, but #lang will enable that, which will make the system much nicer to use. So at that, I'd like to say thank you for listening. I'd like to thank all the wonderful systems out there that have inspired this. I should have listed them on this slide, but Scribble in Racket, Sphinx in Python, the venerable LaTeX and Tech are all great sources of inspiration, and they've taught me a lot about documentation authoring. And now I'm trying to make something that I think will work well for me and hopefully also for you. If you'd like to take a look at the system, you can go to our repository, which is now public, and I'm happy to take any questions here for the remainder of the time slot.
Wonderful. People are already clapping virtually, I see. So
thanks.
I guess Andres, do you have the first question?
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. It's really cool to see this coming up. So I think one of the main, or the first question that comes to mind when I see this is, this makes you think, the genres make you think a lot of literate programming as well. Do you think it'd be possible to do literate programming kind of in the Haskell sense, that you can have a different extension, and if you do the different extension, you just don't have to do the boilerplate to set things up, kind of like that? Is that kind of something that's also thought of for the support?
So literate programming does kind of typically mean two different things. And so in the Haskell sense, just for people in the audience who don't really know Haskell, if you're using Haskell and you end your file extension with LHS instead of AHS, then you get the ability to put your Haskell code either in a sort of LaTeX style environment or with greater than signs before each line of code. And then it essentially inverts the role of comments and of programs, so that the text, the unmarked things are ignored by the compiler, and the marked things are processed by the compiler. And this is nice if you're wanting to either do something complicated or if you're wanting to write some expository material. I think that workflow would be pretty easy to support here. Probably I could do it over the course of an afternoon to a day. I think that we wouldn't need a different file extension, but rather we'd use the #lang feature once that's available here. So we could say like, #lang literate or semi-literate, and then it would work okay. For traditional Knuth style literate programming, where you actually can have little sub-expressions that have independent names and then tangle the whole thing together, that they have that for Scribble. I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that here. I do think it would require a bit more work to get exactly right with all the scoping and everything. But I also think that that's well within the realm of possibility if it's something you'd like to try. And in a couple of weeks, send me an email and maybe I can help you build it if you would like to.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
Patrick is next.
Yeah, thanks, David. As you know, I think this is a very, very important project, and I'm really happy that you're working on this. So first, a silly question, and do you hope that the presentation that you just gave us, I guess the source of this presentation is not a lean file. Do you hope it will become a lean file one day? And this question is, I mean, with the thing that you published on GitHub, the URL that we see, can I already try porting mathematics in lean, or is it too soon?
Okay, so the first question is the source of this presentation. Is it a lean file? No, it's not. It's actually a Python file. I made the slides with Manim. I've been experimenting with different slide technology. Usually I would use Racket, but Manim has really nice animations, and I wanted to try that out here. I don't think that a documentation tool is a good basis for slides typically, because it'll push you in the direction of having slides that are full of bullet points rather than slides that are sort of graphically laid out with diagrams and such. And like, I think defaults are important. You could absolutely build something like Beamer with the tool, but I'm not particularly interested in that myself. And that doesn't mean I wouldn't like to be writing slides in lean, but I don't know that starting with something that looks like a text file is or like a documentation file is the right approach for the way I like to make slides personally. So the second question is it too early to start porting mathematics in lean? Maybe. You are on my short list of people to reach out to immediately for feedback, and so I will like to have a meeting with you soon to discuss that. I suspect that it'll need a couple of features, but I'm not sure which ones are most important. So I'll get in touch soon and get that list of features, and then we can start hopefully working together to make a port, because that's, software that has users is software that becomes good.
Thank you very much. Great.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, John.
Hi, is my mic working?
Sure is.
Great. Thanks for the talk. It was really great to see this coming along. I had a question. Coq has a similar tool with similar goals called Electron. And one thing that's pretty neat about it is that if you have a proof and a bunch of tactics, the tool will sort of collect the intermediate proof state at each tactic. And when you output the document, their tool actually, you can walk through it in HTML as if you're in like an IDE. So I was sort of curious, does the tool capture that intermediate state in the syntax tree, and can you output something like that? Thanks.
So there is Electron support for Lean as well. So this is absolutely a thing that's possible through Lean Inc. I'm not using the Lean Inc code just because it didn't really fit into the structure of this project. Unfortunately, that could have saved a bunch of time. But that is absolutely a feature that I want to implement. I just haven't gotten to it yet.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Alexander.
Hi, congratulations, very, very interesting work. So the first question is maybe silly because I lost the beginning of the presentation. So you compare, you basically enumerate the problems that you see in the markdown itself, right? But what about other markups? Did you consider them, or they are part of your evaluation and previous research to consider the language? This is the first question. The second question is if you can make it public, the list of people that you said that we will contact, and the list of works that you are taking as reference, because that would give us some kind of idea about what are the things that they are looking for, right? And follow the development.
Sure. So if you could mute. Oh, you did mute. Okay, good. Yeah, I was getting some echo. So the first question, did I look at other markups? Absolutely. You know, I looked, I thought it was very important to be highly compatible with Markdown. I think Markdown has won the battle for hearts and minds, and anything that isn't like it is gonna have a hard time getting adopted widely. So that was why I didn't just go with like restructure text, for instance, which has a lot of the properties that I would want to have here. Then there's also, you know, ASCII-Doc. ASCII-Doc isn't that well specified yet. You know, the main specification seems to be the Ruby implementation, and they're doing good work on getting a spec, but it's also quite a big language that would have taken a really long time to implement correctly. And if you're not fully, you know, if you're only going to be, you know, 40% compatible, then really you've just made another language, which is essentially what I've done here. Jot by John McFarlane was a big source of inspiration for many of the specific syntactic choices. And the initial version of this tool actually just used Jot as its concrete syntax. We ended up moving away from it because its extension mechanism didn't really fit in with the way I wanted the extension mechanism to work here in sort of detailed ways that I could get into offline with you if you'd like. And also because it shares the property with Markdown of there being no syntax errors whatsoever. In other words, of every string being a valid Jot document. And you know, I've talked to John about this a little bit, and he's interested in evolving in some ways, but it didn't seem to be quite the right fit, which made me sad because I think Jot is great. And the second question, I don't actually have the list created entirely yet. I'm not sure if I want to be, the decision to be public is like a thing that has like people's feelings involved as well, and I want to not be particularly, I want to be sensitive to that, and so maybe not. But absolutely, all the things that I listed on the slide earlier, like I want to have good support for blueprints, for textbooks, for software documentation of all those 4 types that I mentioned and more, for blog posts, and if there are other genres that are important to have support for something that you think will help Lean get adopted and used, then let me know, and I will do what I can to get them implemented as well.
I had to jump in and cut off questions, but we're a little bit into the coffee break already.
All right.
And I know there's a few more questions. Hopefully they can be taken at the coffee break or maybe stick around here. There's also some questions in Zulip. So this is very interesting work, generating a lot of
Thanks.
You know, attention. So it's great.
Thank you.
So thank you.